Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The Legend of the Open Tombs.
I've always been the skeptical one among my group of friends. Ghost stories, urban legends, and all that spooky stuff never really got to me. So, when the topic of the legend of the open graves came up one night over beers, I was the first to scoff. We were sitting in Matt's basement, the usual hangout spot, dimly lit with just enough shadows to make the mood a little eerie. Jessica, the most superstitious of us, had just finished telling the story. According to local legend, every year on the same night, the graves in the old Maplewood Cemetery would open up, and the dead would come out to find company. Supposedly, they'd drag anyone they found back with them into the earth. Ridiculous, right? Matt, with his usual grin, looked at me. If it's just a story, why don't we prove it? Let's spend the night there, record everything, and put this stupid legend to rest. The idea was stupid. Who in their right mind would want to spend a night in a cemetery, even if they didn't believe in ghosts? But I couldn't back down. The guys would never let me live it down. So, I agreed, figuring it'd just be a boring night of sitting around in the cold. We gathered our gear, flashlights, a camera, some snacks, and piled into Matt's old van. The drive to Maplewood Cemetery was quiet, the weight of what we were about to do slowly sinking in. I stared out the window as the town's lights faded, giving way to the dark, tree-lined road that led to the cemetery. The trees stood tall like silent sentinels, their branches creating twisted shadows under the moonlight. When we finally arrived, the place was even creepier than I expected. The cemetery was ancient, the kind of place where the tombstones are so old and worn that you can barely read the names on them. It was surrounded by an old iron fence, rusty and covered in ivy, with a gate that creaked loudly as we pushed it open. The wind picked up as we entered, sending a chill down my spine, but I shook it off. Just nerves, I told myself. The others were already setting up the camera, trying to act tough, but I could tell they were feeling it too. We found a spot near the center, where the oldest graves were. The moonlight barely filtered through the trees, casting long, shifting shadows across the ground. We huddled together, the laughter and jokes fading as the reality of the situation set in. The first few hours were uneventful. We sat on the cold ground, eating chips and talking about nothing in particular. Every now and then, Jessica would snap a picture or point the camera at something she thought was interesting, but there was nothing. Just tombstones and silence. But as midnight approached, the atmosphere started to change. The wind seemed to die down completely, leaving the air thick and still. I found myself glancing around more often, the shadows seeming to move just out of the corner of my eye. The others fell quiet too, and I could feel the unease growing among us. It was Matt who first noticed something odd. He was fiddling with the camera when he looked up at one of the gravestones nearby. "Hey," he whispered. "Was that stone always tilted like that?" I looked where he was pointing. A large, ancient tombstone, once standing tall, now seemed to lean slightly to the side. I shrugged it off, blaming the years of erosion and neglect, but Matt wasn't convinced. He got up and walked over to it, shining his flashlight around. "Guys, come look at this," he called out, his voice tinged with something I hadn't heard before, uncertainty. We all got up and joined him. The tombstone wasn't just leaning, it looked like the earth around it had shifted, as if something underneath had moved. A knot formed in my stomach. Maybe it was just the ground settling after years of rain, I reasoned. But as I stood there, staring at that gravestone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. And then, just as quickly as the wind had died down, a soft whisper cut through the silence, making my blood run cold. I remember the whisper so clearly, it was almost like a breath against my ear, soft but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned to the others, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. Matt's flashlight was still focused on the tilted tombstone, and I could see the unease in his face. Jessica was already nervously fiddling with the camera, her hands shaking. "Did anyone else hear that?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I heard it," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. But it was probably just the wind. We all looked around, but the night was eerily still. The only sounds were our own breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. We moved back to our spot in the center of the cemetery, hoping that whatever it was would pass. The minutes ticked by slowly. I kept glancing around, convinced that I saw shadows shifting between the graves. At one point, I could have sworn I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. My nerves were on edge, and I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread. Jessica was still focused on the camera, trying to capture any unusual activity. She scanned the area methodically, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The cemetery was quiet, almost too quiet, and the silence was starting to feel oppressive. Then, just as I was about to suggest we call it a night, a faint scraping sound echoed through the cemetery. It was so soft that I almost thought I imagined it, but the look on Matt's face told me he'd heard it too. "What was that?" he asked, his voice tense. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely more than a murmur. "But we should check it out." We slowly moved towards the direction of the sound, the flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The air was getting colder, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, wrapping around us like a shroud. As we approached an old mausoleum at the edge of the cemetery, we saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the iron gates that covered the entrance was ajar, creaking softly as it swayed in the wind. "This wasn't open before, was it?" Jessica asked, her voice trembling. "No," I said, my throat dry. "It must have been closed earlier." Matt approached the gate cautiously, shining his flashlight into the darkness beyond. The interior of the mausoleum was pitch black, and it was impossible to see anything beyond a few feet. "I'm going in," Matt said, stepping forward. "Maybe the sound came from inside." "No way," Jessica said, grabbing his arm. "We should just get out of here." But it was too late. Matt had already entered the mausoleum, and the darkness swallowed him up. We stood there, waiting for him to come back, but the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Just when I was about to call out to him, we heard another sound, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from deep within the ground. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, and it sent chills down my spine. "Matt," I called out, my voice trembling. "Are you okay?" There was no response. We waited, our nerves frayed and our breaths coming in shallow gasps. The wailing continued, growing louder and more desperate. The shadows around us seemed to close in, and I could feel an icy grip of fear tightening around my chest. Suddenly, Matt stumbled out of the mausoleum, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. He didn't say a word as he rejoined us, but his expression told us everything we needed to know. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know," Matt said, his voice shaking. "There was something in there. Something I couldn't see, but I could feel it. It was watching us." The wailing had stopped, but the sense of dread remained. The cemetery felt more oppressive than ever, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. We decided to move away from the mausoleum, our laughter and bravado gone. The air was thick with fear, and every shadow seemed to conceal something sinister. We set up near a large oak tree, hoping that the open space would make us feel safer. But as the night dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cemetery was closing in around us. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. I glanced at the camera feed, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Figures moving among the graves, barely visible but unmistakably there. And that was when I realized the legend was real, and whatever was in the cemetery with us was far more terrifying than I had ever imagined. By the time we settled near the old oak tree, our nerves were frayed, and the cold air felt like it was squeezing the life out of us. We tried to act normal, laughing nervously and making small talk, but the unease was palpable. Every creak and rustle seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. We huddled together, and I found myself glancing at the camera feed more often. The view on the screen was unsettling. Shadows seemed to dance and shift in ways that defied logic. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Around 2 a.m., the mood shifted from uneasy to outright terrifying. A low rumbling sound, like distant thunder, rolled through the cemetery, causing the trees to shudder and the shadows to warp in eerie patterns. It wasn't just the wind, it felt like the ground itself was waking up. "Did anyone else hear that?" Jessica's voice cracked as she clutched her flashlight tighter. "Yeah, I heard it," Matt replied, his voice tight with fear. "It's probably just a storm rolling in." I wanted to believe that, but the ground felt alive beneath my feet. The vibrations were subtle but unmistakable, like a heartbeat from the earth itself. I could see Jessica's breath misting in the cold air, and her eyes darted nervously around the cemetery. Then, without warning, the camera feed went dark. The screen went from a live view of the cemetery to static, and the camera's recording light blinked off. "What the hell?" I muttered, trying to reboot the camera. Matt tried to adjust the settings, but the camera remained stubbornly blank. "It's dead," he said. "The battery must have died." "Great," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just what we need." We were now left in the dark, both literally and figuratively. The shadows seemed to close in around us, and every sound felt amplified. The whispers from earlier had returned, now unmistakably clear, low, mournful voices that seemed to come from all directions. As we tried to get the camera working again, one of the gravestones near us shifted with a loud grinding noise. We all froze, our breaths catching in our throats. The stone, which had seemed solid just minutes before, was now leaning precariously, as though something beneath was pushing it. "Did you see that?" Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes," I replied, my heart pounding. "I saw it." The ground around the shifting tombstone began to crack, and a dark, thick mist began to seep out. The mist curled around the graves, swirling as if drawn by an unseen force. I could feel the temperature drop even further, and a deep chill settled over us. Matt took a step towards the mist, his curiosity momentarily overcoming his fear. "We need to see what's going on. Maybe there's a logical explanation." "Are you kidding me?" Jessica's voice was sharp with panic. "We should get out of here." But before anyone could respond, the mist thickened, and a figure began to materialize in the fog. At first, it was indistinct, a shifting shape that seemed to blend into the darkness. But as it moved closer, the figure became clearer, a shadowy, gaunt figure with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through us. I felt a wave of nausea and fear wash over me. "We need to leave. Now." We turned to head back towards the gate, but the mist seemed to close in around us, making it hard to see. The shadows from the gravestones seemed to twist and reach out towards us, as if trying to keep us in the cemetery. I could hear Jessica's breathing growing faster, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. Matt was at the front, pushing through the mist with determined, but increasingly frantic steps. We stumbled over uneven ground, our flashlights casting erratic beams of light that only seemed to make the shadows more menacing. As we neared the gate, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every shadow seemed to come alive, moving and shifting as if they were trying to block our way. The whispers grew louder, almost forming words that I couldn't quite make out. I glanced back at the cemetery one last time, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The figures, shadows of the dead, were emerging from their graves, moving slowly towards us. Their forms were translucent, almost ghostly, but their presence was unmistakably terrifying. With one final burst of energy, we pushed through the gate and stumbled out onto the path leading back to the van. The cemetery seemed to sigh with relief, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as we put distance between ourselves and the cursed ground. Breathing heavily, we piled into the van, the engine roaring to life. As we drove away, I glanced back through the rearview mirror. The cemetery stood silent and still, but I knew that what we had witnessed was only the beginning. The legend was real, and whatever was in the cemetery with us was far from finished. We drove back to town in near silence, the atmosphere in the van heavy with unspoken fears. The mist and the figures from the cemetery seemed to linger in my mind, their hollow eyes haunting my thoughts. None of us spoke much as Matt navigated the winding road back, our eyes darting around as if expecting something to appear from the darkness. When we finally pulled up to my house, I was relieved to see the familiar surroundings of home. The van doors slammed shut, and we all made our way inside, our steps quick and uneasy. I tried to shake off the fear, but it clung to me like a cold sweat. Inside, we gathered in the living room, the lights on and the safety of the familiar setting providing only a slight comfort. Jessica was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "We need to figure out what just happened. I mean, we saw something, actual ghosts or something like that." Matt nodded in agreement, though his face was pale. "Yeah, but how do we even begin to explain what we saw? The camera's footage is gone. The whole thing feels unreal." I sat down on the couch, trying to steady my breathing. My hands were still shaking, and I could feel a cold sweat on my brow. "We need to talk to someone who might know more about this," I said. "Maybe there's someone who can explain what we experienced." Jessica agreed, and we started searching online for local historians or paranormal experts. We came across an old historian named Mr. Thompson who had written extensively about the town's history and its legends. We decided to pay him a visit, hoping he could shed some light on our terrifying night. The next morning, we drove to Mr. Thompson's house, a quaint, old home on the outskirts of town. The historian greeted us warmly and invited us in. His house was filled with old books and artifacts, and the air was thick with the musty smell of history. We explained our experience, and Mr. Thompson listened intently, his face growing more serious as we spoke. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "What you've described is consistent with some of the older tales about Maplewood Cemetery," he said. "There are stories about the graves opening and the dead walking, though they're usually dismissed as mere legend. But it seems that you've encountered something that defies those explanations." He went on to explain that the cemetery had a dark history. It was built on land that was once part of a settlement plagued by disease and violence. Many of the people buried there had been buried hastily, and some were buried in unmarked or improper graves. According to local folklore, these restless souls would sometimes rise in search of something they had lost: peace, recognition, or even revenge. "I can't say for certain what you encountered," Mr. Thompson continued, "but there have been reports of unusual occurrences in that cemetery. Sometimes, the dead are said to awaken when disturbed, or when there is a disruption to the land." We left Mr. Thompson's house with more questions than answers. His explanations didn't fully ease our fears, but they did provide some context for what we had experienced. The sense of dread that had settled over us the previous night still lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the cemetery's dark presence was still following us. That night, as I tried to sleep, I found it nearly impossible to relax. Every creak in the house, every gust of wind, felt like a sign of something watching me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the events from the cemetery over and over. Around midnight, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from outside my window. My heart leaped into my throat, and I held my breath, trying to listen. The sound grew louder, more persistent, like something, or someone, was trying to get in. I mustered the courage to get up and look outside, but when I pulled back the curtain, there was nothing there. I went back to bed, my mind racing with thoughts of what might be lurking in the darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cemetery wasn't done with us yet. The whispers we heard, the figures we saw, they were all just the beginning. I knew that whatever had happened at the cemetery was far from over, and I could only hope that we'd find a way to confront it before it was too late. The feeling of being watched, of something sinister lurking just beyond the edge of the darkness, stayed with me. I drifted off to a restless sleep, knowing that our encounter with the dead was far from finished. I woke up the next morning feeling like I hadn't slept at all. The gnawing fear from the previous night clung to me, making it hard to focus on anything but the growing sense of dread. The sunlight streaming through the window did little to ease my anxiety. I knew we had to go back to the cemetery. It was the only way to confront whatever was tormenting us. The group reconvened at my house, our faces etched with worry and exhaustion. Matt and Jessica were quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. We knew we had to face what we had seen, or at least find some sort of closure. The idea of going back was terrifying, but the alternative was to live with the fear that something was lurking just out of sight. As we approached the cemetery once more, the familiar landscape looked even more foreboding under the pale morning light. The once innocuous gravestones now seemed to cast long, sinister shadows, and the mist that had risen the previous night still hung in the air, as if the cemetery itself was holding its breath. We parked the van and stepped out, our footsteps echoing in the quiet. The cemetery seemed almost too still, like a predator lying in wait. Our plan was simple: investigate the mausoleum again, see if we could capture any evidence of the phenomena, and hopefully find some answers. We made our way to the mausoleum, the old iron gate creaking as we pushed it open. The inside was just as dark and oppressive as before, but now we were more determined. With renewed resolve, we entered, flashlights in hand, and tried to ignore the chill that seemed to seep into our bones. As we moved deeper into the mausoleum, I noticed something different. The ground was disturbed, scratches and marks were visible, as if something had been dragged or moved recently. My heart raced, and I could see the same fear mirrored on Matt and Jessica's faces. "Stay close," I said, trying to steady my voice. "We need to see if we can find anything that explains what happened." We continued deeper into the mausoleum, our flashlights revealing old, decaying coffins and broken relics. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of dread, and every shadow seemed to conceal something waiting to pounce. Then we heard it, the faint, mournful wail from the night before. It echoed through the mausoleum, growing louder and more anguished. The sound seemed to come from below us, from the depths of the earth itself. Jessica's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "It's coming from down there," she whispered, pointing to a trapdoor in the corner of the mausoleum. Without a word, Matt moved to open the trapdoor. It creaked loudly, revealing a set of old wooden stairs leading down into darkness. The air from below was colder, and the scent of decay was stronger. We descended the stairs, each step heavy with fear and anticipation. The passage was narrow and damp, and the air felt like it was closing in around us. As we reached the bottom, we were met with a large underground chamber, its walls lined with old, forgotten coffins. In the center of the chamber was an altar-like structure, covered in dust and cobwebs. Strange symbols were carved into the stone, and the air was thick with an oppressive energy. The wailing had grown louder, almost deafening, and it seemed to emanate from the very walls. Suddenly, the shadows in the chamber seemed to move of their own accord. Figures began to materialize from the darkness, their forms indistinct but menacing. Their hollow eyes glowed with an eerie light, and their mournful cries filled the chamber. I felt a wave of panic, and I could see Matt and Jessica were equally terrified. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the wailing. We turned to leave, but the passage we had come through was now blocked by a dense, swirling mist. It was as if the chamber was trying to trap us inside. The figures closed in, their ghostly forms reaching out with ghostly hands. In a desperate attempt to escape, I grabbed Matt and Jessica, pulling them towards the altar. I noticed the symbols carved into the stone seemed to pulse with a strange, dark energy. I realized that the altar might be the key to breaking the hold the spirits had over the cemetery. "Help me move this," I shouted, and together we pushed against the altar. It shifted with a loud groan, revealing a hidden compartment beneath it. Inside the compartment was an old, tattered book. The cover was too worn to read, but I could see that it was filled with faded, handwritten pages. I grabbed the book, hoping it held some answers. The wailing grew louder, and the figures became more agitated. I could feel the temperature dropping, and an icy hand seemed to brush against my skin. We stumbled back towards the stairs, clutching the book tightly. As we climbed the stairs, the mist began to clear, and the oppressive energy of the chamber seemed to recede. We emerged into the mausoleum, breathing heavily and looking back at the now empty chamber. The figures were gone, and the wailing had ceased. We left the mausoleum, the morning light feeling like a balm against the cold fear that had gripped us. The cemetery seemed to have returned to its quiet, eerie normality. We drove back home in silence, the book between us. Later, when we examined the book, we found it to be a journal of sorts, detailing rituals and practices intended to appease restless spirits. It seemed to offer some insight into the legends we had encountered, but its true meaning remained elusive. The cemetery was quiet after that night, and though we continued to investigate, we never saw the spirits again. The experience had left us changed, and the fear of the unknown lingered in our minds. The legend of the cemetery remained a part of our lives, a chilling reminder of the night when the dead walked among us. And as I reflect on that night, I know that some legends are not just stories, they are warnings. Warnings about the things that lie just beyond the edge of understanding, waiting for the right moment to emerge from the shadows.
The Night Guard.
I never imagined I'd find myself working as a night watchman in a cemetery, but when you're out of options, you take what you can get. Cedar Grove Cemetery wasn't far from where I lived, and the pay, though modest, was enough to keep the lights on. The interview was brief. The manager seemed more interested in filling the position than asking about my qualifications. I took it as a good sign. Less scrutiny meant I could start immediately. My first night on the job felt eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you're almost desperate for some sound, any sound, to break it. The cemetery stretched out under the pale moonlight, rows of tombstones casting long, crooked shadows that seemed to stretch toward me as I walked by. I wasn't particularly superstitious, but there was something unsettling about being alone among the dead. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the names and dates etched into the weathered stones. It felt intrusive, like I was disturbing something meant to be left alone. As I made my rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was ridiculous, I told myself. There was no one here but me and the resting souls. Still, every now and then, I'd catch a movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting behind a tree, a flicker of light that vanished the moment I turned my head. The air grew colder as the night wore on. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and tried to focus on the job. Walk the perimeter, check the gates, ensure everything was as it should be. Easy enough. But the longer I stayed, the more the unease gnawed at me. I reached the older section of the cemetery, where the tombstones were worn and crumbling. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees, and for a moment, I thought I heard whispers carried on the breeze. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. Nothing. Just the wind. But as I turned to head back, I swear I heard it again. A faint, distant whisper, like someone calling my name. My heart skipped a beat, and I swung the flashlight around, scanning the area. There was no one there. Just rows of silent graves. Get a grip, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. But it lingered, clinging to me like the chill in the air. As I walked back to the small guard's shack at the entrance, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder more than once, convinced that I wasn't as alone as I wanted to believe. By the time my shift ended, I was relieved to see the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. I locked up the gates and headed home, but the unease followed me. I tried to convince myself that it was just nerves, the natural tension of being in a place like that at night. But deep down, I knew there was something more. Something I couldn't quite explain. I told myself it was just the first night jitters, but as I lay in bed later that morning, unable to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had walked into something far more sinister than a simple night watchman job. By the second night, the unease had settled into my bones, a constant hum of anxiety that I couldn't shake. I told myself it was just nerves, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched out across the cemetery, that feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time, almost palpable. I arrived at Cedar Grove Cemetery just as the last rays of sunlight faded, casting the tombstones in a deep, foreboding darkness. The air felt thicker tonight, as if the place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to push the thought aside and focus on my duties. My flashlight flickered as I began my rounds, the beam cutting through the darkness in jittery bursts. I cursed under my breath, tapping it against my palm, trying to steady the light. It was brand new. There was no reason it should be acting up. But it did, and each time it faltered, the shadows seemed to creep closer. The whispers started again not long after I began my patrol. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees like the night before, but this time, they were more distinct, soft, insistent murmurs that seemed to echo all around me. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something unmistakably unsettling about them, like they were meant for me alone. I paused, sweeping the flashlight around in a wide arc, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever, or whatever, might be causing the sound. But the light flickered again, leaving me in near total darkness for a few agonizing seconds. When it finally steadied, I saw nothing but the same old tombstones and trees. No one was there, but the whispers persisted, growing louder, closer. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding weak and uncertain even to my own ears. The whispers stopped abruptly, as if in response, leaving the night deathly silent. The sudden stillness was unnerving, like the calm before a storm. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, but it was no use. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. As I continued my patrol, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was as if unseen eyes were tracking my every move, lurking just out of sight, hidden in the darkness between the graves. My flashlight flickered once more, and in that brief moment of darkness, I swore I saw something, a shadow, a figure, moving at the edge of my vision. I whipped the flashlight in that direction, but the beam only illuminated empty space. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was experiencing. It had to be exhaustion, or maybe my imagination was running wild. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it. The rest of the night was a blur of paranoia and fear. Every creak of a tree branch, every rustle of leaves made me jump, and the whispers, those damn whispers, kept coming back, taunting me. I tried to focus on my job, to remind myself that this was just another night shift, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being toyed with, watched by something I couldn't see. By the time my shift ended, I was a nervous wreck. I locked the gates with trembling hands and practically ran to my car, glancing over my shoulder the entire way. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting the cemetery in a faint, gray light, but it brought no comfort. The whispers, the shadows, they felt too real to ignore. As I drove home, I couldn't stop replaying the night in my mind, trying to make sense of what I had experienced. But no matter how I turned it over, I couldn't shake the growing certainty that whatever was out there wasn't just in my head. Something in that cemetery was watching me, and it didn't want me there. By the third night, I was running on little more than coffee and adrenaline. Sleep had become elusive, and when I did manage to drift off, I was haunted by restless dreams of shifting shadows and whispers that never seemed to leave me. But I had no choice. I needed this job, and I wasn't about to let my mind play tricks on me. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. As I drove to the cemetery, I couldn't shake the dread that clung to me like a second skin. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows on the road ahead, and each one felt like a reminder of what awaited me. Cedar Grove loomed in the distance, its iron gates standing like sentinels against the night. I arrived just as darkness fully enveloped the cemetery, and for a moment I sat in the car, staring at those gates, trying to summon the courage to step out. The silence inside the car was almost comforting, but I knew I couldn't stay there forever. With a deep breath, I grabbed my flashlight, hoping it wouldn't betray me again, and stepped into the night. The air was colder than usual, biting against my skin as I began my rounds. I kept my flashlight low, sweeping it from side to side, searching for anything out of the ordinary. But as the beam passed over the rows of tombstones, a cold chill ran down my spine. The shadows seemed thicker tonight, darker, as if they were more than just the absence of light. Halfway through my patrol, I noticed something strange. The usual whispers had stopped, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence in their wake. It wasn't a relief, though. If anything, it made the atmosphere even more unsettling. I found myself straining to hear anything at all, but there was nothing. Just the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the gravel path. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, a dark shape slipping between the tombstones. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, flashlight aimed in the direction of the movement. But there was nothing there. Just the silent graves, standing like sentinels in the night. I took a cautious step forward, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I swept the flashlight over the area again, but all I saw were shadows, thick and impenetrable. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. As I turned to continue my patrol, I caught another glimpse of movement, this time closer. A dark figure, barely more than a shadow, darted behind a large tombstone. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I wasn't alone. "Show yourself," I demanded, but my voice was weak, swallowed by the darkness around me. The silence was deafening, and for a long moment, I stood there, my flashlight shaking in my hand, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. This time, it wasn't just a flicker of movement. It was a shape, a figure, standing in the shadows near the tree line. Tall, impossibly thin, and almost blending into the night itself. My heart hammered in my chest as I pointed the flashlight directly at it. The light cut through the darkness, but the figure didn't disappear. It stood there, unmoving, watching me. I couldn't make out any details. No face, no features, just a silhouette, darker than the night around it. And then it started to move, slowly, deliberately, stepping out from the shadows and into the open. Panic surged through me, and I took a step back, my mind racing. This wasn't human. It couldn't be. But what else could it be? I stumbled, nearly dropping the flashlight as I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I didn't stop until I reached the guard's shack, slamming the door behind me and locking it with trembling hands. Inside, I leaned against the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. What had I seen? Was it real? It had to be. I wasn't losing my mind. There was something out there, something that had been watching me, waiting for me. As I peered out of the small, dirty window, my heart nearly stopped. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The shadows outside seemed to pulse with life, and every creak of the old shack made me jump. I knew I couldn't stay there forever, but the thought of going back out into the cemetery filled me with dread. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the shack, my eyes glued to the window, flashlight clutched in my hand like a lifeline. I kept expecting to see that figure again, but it never reappeared. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into eternity, until finally, the first light of dawn broke through the darkness. As I left the cemetery that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line, that whatever was out there had taken notice of me, and it wasn't going to let me go so easily. By the time the fourth night rolled around, I was already on edge, every nerve in my body wound tight like a spring ready to snap. Sleep had become a distant memory, replaced by constant paranoia and dread. The shadowy figure I had seen the previous night haunted my every thought, its image burned into my mind. No matter how hard I tried to convince myself that it was all just a trick of the light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent was lurking in the cemetery, waiting for me. As I drove to Cedar Grove, the sun setting behind me, casting long shadows over the road, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle in the pit of my stomach. Every instinct screamed at me to turn the car around and never look back, but I knew I couldn't do that. I needed this job, as terrifying as it had become. So, I pushed the fear down as best I could and forced myself to keep going. When I arrived at the cemetery, the air was thick with a suffocating stillness. The wind had died down, leaving the trees eerily motionless, their branches casting twisted shadows across the tombstones. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath my boots sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet night. The moment I passed through the gates, that oppressive feeling of being watched returned with a vengeance, stronger than ever before. It felt as though a pair of invisible eyes were boring into the back of my skull, tracking my every move. My hands shook as I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, but it offered little comfort. I began my rounds, every sense heightened, listening for any sound that might betray the presence of the figure I had seen before. The cemetery was dead silent, no whispers, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural, almost suffocating quiet that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. As I walked between the rows of tombstones, I felt it again, that cold, creeping sensation of being followed. I whipped around, the flashlight beam darting across the graves, but there was nothing. Just empty space and shadows that seemed to dance just beyond the edge of the light. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. The figure was out there, somewhere, watching me, waiting. I could feel its presence, like a cold breath on the back of my neck, and it was driving me to the brink of madness. I forced myself to keep moving, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Every step felt like it was taking me deeper into some unseen trap, but I couldn't stop. The job demanded it, and so did whatever was out there in the dark. Halfway through my patrol, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound that sent a chill down my spine. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand, and listened. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but when I turned around, the beam of light revealed nothing. The path behind me was empty, but the footsteps didn't stop. Panic gripped me, and I began to back away, the flashlight darting back and forth in a desperate attempt to catch a glimpse of whatever was following me. But the footsteps just kept coming, echoing in the silence, as if someone, or something, was stalking me, playing with me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice breaking with fear. No answer. The footsteps paused, then resumed, closer this time, almost directly behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat as I finally saw it, a figure, tall and shadowy, standing just at the edge of the flashlight's beam. It was the same as before, but now I could see it more clearly. It wasn't just a shadow, it had form, a vague outline of a person, but with no discernible features. Just darkness, deeper than the night itself. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back, the flashlight shaking uncontrollably in my hand. "Stay back," I shouted, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, silent and still. The air around me grew colder, and a sense of overwhelming dread washed over me. I knew I had to get out of there, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground, paralyzed by fear. Then, slowly, the figure began to move. It didn't walk, it seemed to glide, effortlessly, across the ground, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The closer it got, the more suffocating the air became, like it was draining the life out of the very space around it. Finally, something inside me snapped, and I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the gravel path as I sprinted towards the guard's shack. The footsteps echoed behind me, matching my pace, growing louder, closer, until I could almost feel the figure's presence right behind me, reaching out to grab me. I burst into the shack, slamming the door shut behind me, and collapsed against it, gasping for breath. The silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic pounding of my heart. I dared not look out the window, too terrified of what I might see. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. I sat there, huddled in the corner, every nerve on edge, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the shack remained silent, the figure outside unseen, but not forgotten. It was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting. When dawn finally broke, I mustered the courage to peek outside. The cemetery was bathed in the pale light of morning, the shadows retreating, but the sense of dread remained. The figure was gone, but I knew it was only a matter of time before it returned. I left Cedar Grove that morning with a sick feeling in my gut, knowing that whatever had been following me wasn't finished. The nightmare was far from over. I knew I couldn't keep going back to Cedar Grove, but quitting wasn't an option. The job paid too well, and with bills piling up, I had no choice but to return. But something had changed in me after that last encounter. I was no longer just scared, I was terrified. The thought of spending another night in that cemetery made my blood run cold, but the dread of what might happen if I didn't finish what I started was even worse. So, I found myself back at Cedar Grove on that final night, the sense of impending doom hanging over me like a dark cloud. As I parked my car and stepped out into the chilly night air, I could feel the weight of the cemetery pressing down on me, like the entire place was alive and aware of my presence. Every instinct screamed at me to get back in the car and leave, but I knew there was no escape, not anymore. I walked to the guard's shack, my legs heavy with fear, and turned on the flashlight, even though I knew it wouldn't help. The cemetery was eerily quiet. Not even the wind dared to disturb the stillness. The shadows seemed deeper, darker, as if they were waiting for something, waiting for me. I started my rounds, each step feeling like I was moving closer to some inevitable, horrifying end. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the crunch of gravel underfoot and the rapid beating of my heart. I was hyper-aware of everything around me, every shadow, every flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. But the figure didn't show itself, not yet. I passed row after row of tombstones, the names on them blurring together in the darkness. I kept my pace steady, though my hands trembled, my breath shallow. I was halfway through my patrol when I heard it again, those familiar, dreaded footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me, echoing in the silent night. I turned around, the flashlight beam slicing through the dark, but saw nothing. The path behind me was empty, but the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, until I could feel the vibrations underfoot, as if something was right behind me, just out of sight. I didn't dare turn around again. I knew what I would see. Instead, I quickened my pace, my heart racing as I headed back towards the guard's shack, my only sanctuary. But the footsteps followed, matching my speed, relentless in their pursuit. I was almost running now, panic clawing at my chest, but I couldn't stop. I had to make it back to the shack. Suddenly, the footsteps ceased, replaced by a cold, deathly silence that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I stopped in my tracks, the flashlight flickering in my hand. The air around me seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping rapidly until my breath came out in visible puffs. And then I saw it, just ahead, standing in the path to the shack. The figure. This time, it wasn't at the edge of the light, but fully illuminated by the flashlight's beam. It was tall, impossibly tall, with a dark, shadowy form that seemed to absorb the light around it. There were no features, no eyes, just an overwhelming sense of malice that radiated from it, chilling me to the bone. I froze, rooted to the spot, unable to move as the figure began to glide towards me. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, as if it wasn't bound by the same physical laws as everything else. The closer it got, the more intense the cold became, until I was shivering uncontrollably, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. My body was paralyzed, trapped in the figure's icy grip. It was only a few feet away now, and I could feel its presence suffocating me, draining the warmth and life from the air around me. The flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, I thought it would go out completely, leaving me in total darkness with this thing. But just as it seemed like the figure was about to reach me, something inside me snapped. I don't know if it was adrenaline or sheer terror, but I found the strength to move. I bolted, sprinting the last few yards to the guard's shack, throwing the door open and slamming it shut behind me. I locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key, and collapsed against the door, my heart pounding in my ears. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The only sound was my own ragged breathing, my pulse thudding in my temples. I half expected the figure to come crashing through the door, to drag me out into the night, but it didn't. The silence stretched on, oppressive and terrifying. I forced myself to look out the small window. The cemetery was still, the tombstones bathed in pale moonlight, but there was no sign of the figure. It was gone, vanished into the shadows from which it had come. I stayed in the shack for the rest of the night, too scared to move, too scared to even think. When dawn finally broke, I grabbed my things and left Cedar Grove without looking back. I quit that day, abandoning the job and the paycheck, knowing I would never return. But the experience never left me. To this day, I can still feel those cold, malevolent eyes watching me from the shadows, waiting. Every time I close my eyes, I see the figure standing there, silent and still, a reminder of the horror I barely escaped. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and dark, I can still hear those footsteps, echoing in the back of my mind, as if the figure is still out there, still looking for me, waiting for the day when I won't be able to escape.
The voice from the grave.
I still remember the day we buried Grandma like it was yesterday. The sky was overcast, and a chill hung in the air, as if the world itself was mourning her loss. She had been everything to me, my confidant, my guide, my rock. Since she passed away, there hasn't been a day when I haven't felt the weight of her absence pressing down on me. In the weeks following her funeral, I found myself drawn to the cemetery every evening. It became my ritual, a way to feel closer to her, to find some semblance of peace. I would sit by her grave, talking to her as if she could hear me, sharing my thoughts and fears, my hopes and regrets. I didn't know if it helped, but it was the only thing that made me feel connected to her in her absence. One particularly foggy evening, I arrived at the cemetery and noticed that the air was even colder than usual. I wrapped my coat tighter around me and made my way to Grandma's resting place. The gravestone was etched with her name, surrounded by the delicate flowers I brought daily. As I settled down on the grass beside it, I felt a strange sense of calm, despite the eeriness of the fog swirling around us. I started speaking softly, as usual, telling her about my day, about the little things that seemed so trivial but felt so important to share. It was during these moments that I felt closest to her, as if she were somehow still here, listening. And then, I heard it, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees, or perhaps my imagination playing tricks on me. But then the whisper came again, clearer this time. It was almost as if someone was softly calling my name from just beyond the veil of fog. "Emily!" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper was so gentle, so familiar, that it felt like it was coming from Grandma herself. I glanced around, expecting to see someone nearby, but the cemetery was as empty and silent as ever. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It must have been the stress of the past few weeks, or perhaps the fog was causing strange acoustics. I leaned back against the gravestone, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. But the whispers continued, growing fainter but more insistent, calling my name again and again. I felt a shiver run down my spine and struggled to convince myself that it was nothing more than a figment of my imagination. Still, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Despite the chill in the air, I stayed there for a while longer, speaking to the darkness, hoping for some sign that I wasn't losing my mind. When I finally stood up to leave, I looked back at the grave, half expecting to see something, anything, that would explain the whispers. But the cemetery remained as still and quiet as ever, the fog swirling around the tombstones like a ghostly shroud. I walked back to my car, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had heard something more than just the wind. The whispering voice lingered in my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder if Grandma was trying to tell me something, or if I was simply hearing what I wanted to hear. The following evening, I found myself back at the cemetery, unable to stay away despite the unsettling experience from the night before. It had become a sort of compulsion, a desperate attempt to reach out to Grandma in whatever way I could. As I drove through the dimly lit streets towards the cemetery, my thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and anxiety. The whispers from the night before had left me both intrigued and frightened. The fog had thickened again, curling around the gravestones like a living entity. The cemetery seemed different tonight, more foreboding, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation. I parked my car and made my way to Grandma's grave, the only source of light coming from the dim glow of a single street lamp far in the distance. As I sat down on the grass beside her grave, I tried to steady my breathing. The cold air was sharp against my skin, and I could see my breath forming small, ghostly clouds in the dim light. I began speaking softly, trying to keep my composure, recounting the mundane events of my day in the hope that it might somehow bring me comfort. And then, I heard it again. The whisper. This time, it was clearer and more insistent. My heart skipped a beat as I listened, straining to catch the words. The voice seemed to be coming from just behind the tombstones, as if someone was standing just out of sight, murmuring my name. Emily! My skin prickled with fear, and I stood up abruptly, scanning the shadows between the graves. The cemetery was still. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I took a few hesitant steps towards the direction of the voice, but there was no one there. I felt a surge of frustration mixed with fear. My logical mind was telling me that it was probably just my imagination running wild, fueled by the grief and loneliness I had been experiencing. But the whispers were persistent, growing more distinct, almost pleading. "Help me!" I felt a chill run down my spine as the words echoed in my mind. It was as if the voice was not just calling me, but asking for something I couldn't quite grasp. The whisper was accompanied by an almost imperceptible shuffling sound, like footsteps moving through the damp grass. I glanced around again, my eyes darting nervously from one shadow to another. My heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed to drown out all other sounds. I felt as though I was being watched, but every time I turned, there was nothing but the oppressive darkness and the fog rolling in thick waves. Desperate for any sign of normalcy, I tried to calm myself. I took a deep breath and sat back down, trying to focus on the comforting presence of Grandma's grave. I continued speaking, though my voice trembled with fear. I tried to tell myself that the whispers were nothing more than a trick of the mind, a result of my own heightened emotions and the eerie atmosphere. But deep down, a nagging thought refused to leave me. What if there was something more to the whispers? What if they were trying to tell me something important, something I needed to understand? I resolved to come back the next night, hoping to find some clarity, but also dreading what I might uncover. As I finally left the cemetery, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The shadows seemed to follow me as I walked back to my car, and the whispers continued to haunt my thoughts, growing more insistent with each step. The cemetery, once a place of solace, had become a place of dark and unsettling mystery, and I was drawn into its depths, unable to turn away. The next morning, I awoke with a heavy heart and an uneasy mind. The whispers from the cemetery had been haunting my dreams, leaving me with a profound sense of dread. I needed to find answers, to understand what was happening. I decided it was time to dig into my grandmother's past, hoping to find something that might explain the eerie occurrences. I spent the day going through Grandma's belongings, searching for any clues that might shed light on the mysterious whispers. Her house, once filled with warmth and love, now felt cold and empty, a stark reminder of her absence. I rummaged through old photo albums, letters, and keepsakes, each item bringing back bittersweet memories. It was in a dusty corner of her attic that I found an old, leather-bound diary. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. I recognized it immediately as something Grandma had kept for years. My hands trembled as I opened it, hoping to find some hint of what might be behind the whispers. The diary was filled with entries detailing her daily life, but as I read on, I came across a section that was different from the rest. The entries were fragmented, written in a hurried and distressed hand. Grandma wrote about strange occurrences at the cemetery, shadows moving among the graves, whispers in the night. She had been investigating something dark and sinister that seemed to be tied to the cemetery. One entry stood out to me. Asterisk, the whispers have become more urgent. I'm afraid it's too late. There's something I must do before it's too late. They say the curse will come for those who disturb the dead. I never believed it until now. Asterisk. The revelation was chilling. Grandma had been aware of something dark and malevolent connected to the cemetery. She had even mentioned a curse, a notion that had seemed far-fetched until now. My heart raced as I realized that the whispers I had been hearing might not be a figment of my imagination, but a manifestation of something far more sinister. Determined to uncover the truth, I continued reading. The diary mentioned an old family secret tied to the cemetery, something that had been buried with the dead. It hinted at a betrayal and a curse that had been set into motion many years ago. The more I read, the clearer it became that my grandmother's death might not have been natural, and the whispers were likely a cry for help from beyond the grave. I had to know more. I decided to return to the cemetery that night, armed with a diary and a sense of urgency. I needed to find out what Grandma had discovered, and why the whispers were now calling me. As I prepared to go back, I felt a mix of fear and determination. The cemetery had become a place of dark mystery, and I was drawn into its depths, searching for answers that might be more horrifying than I could ever imagine. That night, as I walked through the dimly lit streets towards the cemetery, the fog seemed thicker than ever, and the shadows more menacing. I clutched the diary tightly, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. The whispers were waiting, and I was ready to face whatever truths they might reveal, no matter how terrifying they might be. The cemetery was shrouded in an even denser fog that night, making it feel as though I was stepping into another world entirely. My heart pounded with a mix of dread and determination as I made my way to Grandma's grave. The diary was clutched tightly in my hands, its leather cover cold and heavy with the weight of the secrets it contained. As I approached the graveyard, the familiar landscape of tombstones and mausoleums seemed almost alien. The fog curled around the gravestones like ghostly fingers, and the silence was so profound that it felt suffocating. I found myself questioning my sanity, wondering if I was chasing shadows and nightmares. But the urgency of the whispers and the revelations from Grandma's diary kept me moving forward. I reached Grandma's grave and set up a small lantern beside it to cast a dim, flickering light. Sitting down on the grass, I opened the diary once more, my hands trembling. I read the fragmented entries again, trying to piece together the cryptic messages about the curse and the dark presence haunting the cemetery. The diary mentioned a specific grave, a crypt that had been sealed for decades, containing a family secret that had gone unnoticed until Grandma's investigation. According to the diary, disturbing this grave would awaken a curse set in motion by a betrayal that had occurred many years ago. The fog thickened, and a chill settled over me as I looked up from the diary. I felt a shiver of apprehension as I noticed something unsettling. The shadows between the graves seemed to be moving, shifting in a way that defied logic. The tombstones appeared to tremble slightly, as if something beneath them was stirring. My breath quickened as I heard it again, the whispering. It was louder now, more insistent, and it seemed to be coming from all directions. The voice was no longer just calling my name, it was pleading for help, filled with an urgency that sent a wave of terror through me. "Emily, please." The voice seemed to come from the direction of the crypt mentioned in the diary. I swallowed hard and forced myself to stand up, grabbing a flashlight from my bag. The beam of light cut through the fog as I made my way towards the crypt, my heart racing with every step. The crypt was old and imposing, covered in ivy and looking as if it hadn't been disturbed in decades. The inscription on the stone was worn, nearly illegible. I approached it cautiously, shining the flashlight over the surface. The whispers grew louder, and I could almost hear the mournful cries of the dead seeping through the stone. I hesitated for a moment, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. But the urgency of the whispers compelled me to act. I reached into my bag and pulled out a crowbar I had brought with me, determined to open the crypt and uncover whatever was hidden inside. With a series of grunts and strained efforts, I pried open the heavy stone lid. Dust and musty air poured out from the opening, and I recoiled at the foul smell. As the lid moved, the whispers intensified, growing almost deafening. I shone the flashlight inside, revealing a set of ancient, ornate coffins. One coffin, in particular, caught my eye. It was different from the others, more elaborately decorated, with strange symbols carved into the wood. The whispers seemed to emanate from this coffin, a chilling, mournful sound that sent shivers down my spine. I took a deep breath and slowly lifted the lid of the coffin. The sight that met my eyes was both horrifying and sorrowful. Inside was an old skeleton, dressed in tattered, ancient clothing. The skeleton was surrounded by objects and symbols that seemed to suggest a ritualistic burial, something meant to trap or bind the spirit. I realized with a sinking feeling that this was not just about Grandma. The curse mentioned in the diary was real, and it was tied to this crypt. The whispers were not only her plea for help but also a warning, a desperate cry to break the curse before it claimed yet another victim. As I stood there, the fog seemed to swirl more violently around the cemetery, and the shadows grew darker and more ominous. I felt a chilling presence behind me, as though the very air was thick with the anguish of the trapped spirits. I knew now that the curse was far from over, and my own life might be in danger if I couldn't find a way to put things right. The realization hit me with full force. I had to act quickly and find a way to break the curse before it consumed me and anyone else who might come seeking solace in the cemetery. The night was far from over, and the real horror was just beginning to unfold. The sight of the coffin's contents left me paralyzed with fear. My mind raced as I tried to process the implications of what I had uncovered. The whispers were now a cacophony, filling the cemetery with a desperate, mournful wail that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The curse was real, and it was far from over. I knew I had to do something, but what? The diary had mentioned a ritual to break the curse, but it hadn't provided any specifics. The symbols and objects around the skeleton seemed to be part of that ritual, but without knowing how to use them, I was at a loss. Desperation drove me to examine the items more closely, hoping for some clue or instruction. I spotted an old leather-bound book lying among the remains, its cover etched with similar symbols to those on the coffin. With trembling hands, I opened it and began to read. The pages were filled with archaic text and illustrations of rituals that seemed almost too elaborate to comprehend. As I skimmed through the pages, I found a section that described a ceremony meant to release trapped souls and break curses. The ritual involved a series of incantations and the placement of specific items around the grave. My heart pounded as I realized that this was my only chance to set things right. I gathered the items around the skeleton, candles, herbs, and a small vial of what looked like holy water, carefully arranging them as described in the book. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic, as if they were urging me to complete the ritual. With the setup complete, I took a deep breath and began to recite the incantations from the book. My voice trembled as I spoke the ancient words, and the fog around the cemetery seemed to swirl and intensify. The shadows grew darker, and I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. The temperature dropped sharply, and my breath came out in visible puffs. As I reached the final incantation, I noticed a change. The whispers began to fade, and a sense of calm started to replace the overwhelming dread. The shadows that had seemed so menacing now appeared to recede, and the oppressive atmosphere began to lift. It was as if the very essence of the curse was being drawn out and dispelled. I continued the ritual, pouring the holy water around the crypt and lighting the candles. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the surrounding tombstones, but the sense of malevolence that had pervaded the cemetery was starting to dissipate. My voice grew steadier as I completed the final words of the incantation, and the whispers finally fell silent. The fog began to lift, and the cemetery seemed to return to its peaceful, albeit somber, state. The air was still and heavy, but the oppressive darkness had vanished. I felt a profound sense of relief, mixed with exhaustion. I had no way of knowing if the curse was truly broken or if there were more layers to the mystery, but for now, the immediate threat seemed to have subsided. As I packed up my things and prepared to leave, I glanced back at Grandma's grave. The whispers had stopped, and the cemetery felt less haunted. I knew that the experience would stay with me forever, but I also felt a sense of closure. I had done what I could to help Grandma and to confront the darkness that had plagued the cemetery. The drive home was quiet, and the fog that had once seemed so ominous was now just a light mist, fading as the night wore on. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to the story, but for now, I was grateful for the reprieve. The cemetery had been a place of nightmares, but it had also revealed hidden truths and offered a glimpse into the unknown. As I lay down to sleep that night, I knew I had faced something terrifying and emerged stronger for it. The whispers might be gone, but the memory of that night would linger, a haunting reminder of the dark secrets that lie just beneath the surface of the world we know.